The iron shackles bit deep into Jamie's wrists as his knees struck the sun-scorched earth of the workhouse yard. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead despite the merciless desert heat pressing down on Copper Gulch like a blacksmith's anvil. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the suffocating temperature, but from the gnawing terror that had become his constant companion since Billy Morrison had started coughing blood 3 nights ago. The 12-year-old boy's breathing came in shallow gasps as he remembered his mother's gentle voice from what felt like a lifetime ago. Jamie's sweetheart had always helped those who need it most. That's what makes us human. The memory of Sarah Cross's loving words cut through his fear like a blade, giving him strength, even as the metal restraints carved fresh wounds into his already scarred flesh. "Not, stop your sniveling, you little wretch," snarled Silas Crenshaw, the head overseer, as he locked the scorching chains around Jamie's ankles. The metal had been sitting in the desert sun all morning, and Jamie bit down hard on his tongue to keep from screaming. Blood filled his mouth, metallic and warm, but it was better than giving these demons the satisfaction of hearing him cry out. Stubborn little bastard thought he could play hero. Maddox grunted, securing the chains to the weathered punishment post with practiced efficiency. Maybe a few hours roasting out here will teach him that charity ain't rewarded in this godforsaken place. Through the gaps in the wooden fence surrounding the compound, Jamie could see the faces of townspeople who had gathered to witness his punishment. Mrs. Henderson from the general store pressed a lace handkerchief to her trembling lips, her eyes glistening with tears she dared not shed openly. Old Pete the blacksmith stood rigid as a statue, his weathered hands gripping the fence rail, until his knuckles turned bone white. Even Doc Patterson lingered among the crowd, his medical bag hanging uselessly at his side, his sacred oath to do no harm, rendered meaningless by Sheriff Harper's iron authority. "I just wanted to help Billy." Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible above the ominous rattling of the chains. His lungs are filling with dust from the mine work. He can't breathe, and they won't even give him clean water. Silas's calloused hand cracked across Jamie's cheek like a gunshot, snapping his head sideways. "What did Sheriff Harper tell you about backtalk, boy? You speak when spoken to, and not one blessed second before." As the 2 overseers strutted away, their contemptuous laughter echoing across the yard like the cries of carrion birds, Jamie slumped against the post and tried to find a position that didn't cause the shackles to dig deeper into his raw flesh. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and he could already feel his exposed skin beginning to blister and peel. In the distance beyond the fence and the watching crowd, a dust cloud rose on the horizon like smoke from a funeral pyre. A lone rider approached the town, his horse's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-pan desert floor. The harsh sunlight caught something metallic on the rider's saddle, a tarnished badge that swayed hypnotically with each step of his mount. But Jamie's vision was blurring from the heat and pain, and he couldn't make out the details of the approaching figure. He had no way of knowing that after 4 years of bitter absence, his father was finally coming home. Ethan Cross sat tall in his saddle. Despite the dull ache in his bones, his weathered hands steady on the reins, as Copper Gulch materialized from the desert haze like a mirage. At 43, he bore the scars of a life lived hard and fast, silver streaking his dark hair, deep lines etched around his eyes like dry creek beds, and a puckered bullet scar on his left shoulder where a bandit's lead had nearly ended his wandering days. But it was the crushing weight in his chest, the suffocating burden of guilt and regret, that marked him most profoundly. 4 years. 4 endless years since he'd fled this place like a yellow-bellied coward, abandoning his 8-year-old son to be raised by distant relatives, while he drowned his sorrows in rot-gut whiskey and self-pity. 4 years since Sarah's death had shattered his world like glass, transforming him from a respected sheriff into a broken-down drunk who couldn't face his own reflection in a mirror, let alone his responsibilities as a father and protector. The memories crashed over him like a flash flood as he rode through the familiar landscape. Sarah's melodic laughter echoing through their small house on Elm Street during happier times. Jamie's first day of school, the boy clutching his father's calloused hand as they walked to the one-room schoolhouse. The way his beloved wife's eyes had sparkled like stars when she talked about their future together, about the children they would raise, and the legacy they would build in this harsh but beautiful frontier land. And then came the fever, the cursed fever that had swept through the town like wildfire, claiming the young and old alike with merciless efficiency. He'd watched helplessly as it consumed his darling Sarah, burning through her delicate body with an intensity that no amount of desperate prayer or frontier medicine could stop. She died in his arms on a sweltering August night, her final words a whispered plea for him to take care of their precious boy. Instead, he'd sent Jamie away to Sarah's relatives in Millbrook and turned to the bottle, convincing himself that his son was better off without a father who couldn't even keep his own family safe. The guilt had been a living creature gnawing at his insides, like a cancer, until whiskey became the only thing that could silence its relentless voice. He'd abandoned his duties as sheriff, abandoned his responsibilities to the community, and most unforgivably, abandoned his son when the boy needed him most. But the dreams had never stopped. Night after night, Sarah would appear to him in his whiskey-soaked sleep, her gentle face etched with disappointment and sorrow. "You're stronger than this, Ethan," she would whisper. "Our boy needs his father. Don't let the darkness win." The visions had haunted him across 4 years of drifting, following him from saloon to saloon like a ghost seeking justice. It had taken a near-death experience to finally break through the fog of alcohol and despair. 6 months ago, bandits had ambushed him on a lonely stretch of desert road, beating him senseless with rifle butts and leaving him for dead under the scorching sun. An elderly Mexican woman named Maria Consuela had found him half-conscious and bleeding, nursed him back to health in her small adobe home, and listened with infinite patience to his drunken confessions about the family he destroyed through his weakness. El dolor sin propósito es solamente sufrimiento, she'd told him when he was strong enough to understand. But pain with purpose, mijo, that can become healing. Your wife, she speaks to you in dreams. No, she tells you to come home. The words had struck him like lightning, piercing through years of self-deception and cowardice. Slowly, painfully, he'd begun to piece his shattered life back together. He'd found honest work on a cattle ranch, earned enough money to buy a horse and basic supplies, and most importantly, he'd stayed sober, despite the constant clawing need for whiskey that still haunted his darkest moments. When he'd finally summoned the courage to write to Sarah's relatives in Millbrook, the response had been devastating. The family had perished in a house fire 2 years ago, and Jamie had been sent back to Copper Gulch to live with local authorities. The phrase had sent ice water through Ethan's veins, for he knew what local authorities meant in a frontier town, orphanages, workhouses, or worse. Now, as he approached the outskirts of Copper Gulch, Ethan felt the familiar cocktail of hope and terror that had driven him to push his horse harder than he should have, racing across the desert, with the desperation of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The town looked different, smaller somehow, more run down than he remembered. Several buildings stood empty like broken teeth, their windows boarded up with weathered planks, and the people on the streets moved with the hurried, fearful gait of those living under occupation. But it was the sight of the massive wooden structure on the east side of town that made his blood run cold as Winter Creek water. The building squatted on the landscape like a malignant tumor, surrounded by a high fence topped with cruel barbed wire. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read, "Copper Gulch Workhouse, Sheriff J. Harper, Administrator." Ethan's hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles turned white. A workhouse in his town. The very existence of such a facility meant that everything had changed during his absence, and not for the better. Workhouses were supposed to be places of last resort, refuges for the destitute and homeless. But in the wrong hands, they could become something far more sinister, factories of human misery designed to generate profit from the suffering of the innocent. As he rode closer, the sound of children's voices reached his ears, not the joyful cries of youngsters at play, but the strained, exhausted murmurs of those pushed beyond their limits. Through the gaps in the fence, he could see small figures moving about the yard like worker ants, hauling buckets of water that seemed too heavy for their thin arms, scrubbing laundry on washboards until their knuckles bled, chopping wood with axes that dwarfed their small frames. And then he saw him, Jamie, his son, his precious boy, chained to a post in the center of the yard like a common criminal or a rabid dog. The child had grown taller in the 4 years since Ethan had last seen him, but he was painfully thin, his clothes little more than sun-bleached rags hanging from his skeletal frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises, and his once bright blonde hair was matted with dirt, sweat, and what looked like dried blood. But it was unmistakably Jamie Sarah's gentle features refined by suffering, the stubborn set of his jaw that he'd inherited from his father, the way he held himself with quiet dignity even in the face of such degradation. Sweet Jesus. Ethan breathed, his voice barely a whisper, as the full horror of the situation crashed over him like an avalanche. He dismounted his horse with trembling hands, tied the reins to a hitching post with fingers that shook like autumn leaves, and strode toward the workhouse entrance. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, and he could hear voices inside, men laughing about something that made his skin crawl like insects. Thus, teach the little bastard to keep his mouth shut, one voice was saying with obvious relish. Few more hours in them chains ought to break his spirit proper. Maybe then he'll learn not to go stealing food for that sick Morrison boy. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Jamie was being punished for trying to help another child, for showing the kind of compassion that Sarah had always said was the mark of a truly good heart. The realization that his son was suffering for an act of kindness filled Ethan with a rage so pure and focused that it threatened to consume him like wildfire. He kicked the door open with such explosive force that it slammed against the wall, causing the 3 men inside to leap to their feet like startled jackrabbits. 2 were rough-looking overseers in sweat-stained shirts, their hands instinctively moving to the wooden clubs at their belts. The 3rd was a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and cold blue eyes that reminded Ethan of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Sheriff Jed Harper, I presume. Ethan said, his voice deadly calm, despite the fury burning in his chest like a forge. I'm Ethan Cross, and that's my son chained up in your yard like a mangy cur. Harper looked him up and down with obvious contempt, taking in the dusty clothes, the worn boots, the stubble on his jaw. A slow smile spread across his face, not the warm expression of greeting, but something cold and predatory. Ethan Cross, he repeated slowly, as if savoring the name like fine wine. The drunk who used to wear this badge before he ran off like a yellow-bellied coward. I heard you were dead. Disappointed. Ethan stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving toward where his gun should have been. He deliberately left it with his horse, hoping to avoid trouble. But now he regretted that decision with every fiber of his being, not disappointed. Harper replied, his smile widening. Curious. What brings the great Ethan Cross back to civilization, run out of saloons to drink dry? I want my son released, now. Harper's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with the rattle of a snake. Your son? You mean the little thief who's been stealing bread from hard-working folks? He's serving his sentence just like any other criminal. He's 12 years old, for Christ's sake. Old enough to know right from wrong. Harper's voice turned cold and hard as winter iron. The boy's been in the workhouse for 2 years, ever since his guardians died in that unfortunate fire. He's been fed, clothed, and given honest work to do. More than he deserves considering his criminal tendencies. 2 years. The words hit Ethan like a sledgehammer to the chest, driving the air from his lungs. Jamie had been in this hellhole for 2 years, while he'd been wallowing in self-pity and whiskey, feeling sorry for himself instead of taking care of his responsibilities. The guilt threatened to crush him like a boulder, but he forced himself to focus on the present crisis. What crime? He demanded, his voice rising like a man on the edge of explosion. What could a child possibly have done to deserve this treatment? Theft. Harper replied with matter-of-fact coldness. Caught him red-handed, stealing bread from Morrison's bakery. The boy showed no remorse, claimed he was trying to help some other street rat. We don't tolerate that kind of bleeding heart nonsense in my town. Your town. Ethan's voice cracked like a whip. This is my town, Harper. I was sheriff here for 7 years before you turned into a drunk and abandoned your post like a coward. Harper interrupted, his eyes glittering with malicious pleasure. Before you left your own son to fend for himself like a stray dog. You have no authority here, Cross. You're nothing but a washed-up has-been, and if you know what's good for you, you'll climb back on that horse and ride out of here before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace. The words stung because they carried more than a grain of truth. Ethan had abandoned his post, had failed his son, had chosen the bottle over his responsibilities. But that was the old Ethan Cross, the broken man, who had fled from his pain instead of facing it. The man standing here now had been forged in the crucible of suffering and emerged stronger for it. I'm not leaving without my son, he said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence. Harper's smile turned predatory. Yes, you are. Because if you cause any more trouble, if you so much as set foot on Workhouse property again, I'll make sure that boy suffers for it. Right now, he gets fed once a day and a place to sleep. Keep pushing me, and he'll find out what real hunger feels like. The threat hung in the air, like smoke from a gunshot. Ethan looked into Harper's eyes and saw the cold calculation there, the absolute certainty that he would carry out his threat without hesitation. But there was something else in those reptilian eyes, a flicker of recognition, as if Harper knew him from somewhere other than reputation. You've got 30 seconds to get out of my sight. Harper continued pulling out an ornate pocket watch and making a show of checking the time. After that, Silas and Maddox here will escort you to the town limits. And trust me, Cross, you don't want to find out how they handle troublemakers in my establishment. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment the room balanced on the knife's edge of violence. But then he heard it, a sound that cut through his rage like a blade through silk. From somewhere in the yard came the soft, broken voice of a child calling out, "Papa, Papa, is that really you?" Jamie had heard the commotion. Through the thin walls of the workhouse, he'd recognized his father's voice. The voice he'd dreamed about for 4 long years. The voice that had whispered bedtime stories and promised to always keep him safe. The boy's faith was absolute, unshakable despite everything that had happened. And that faith, fragile as spun glass, but strong as steel, gave Ethan the strength to make the hardest decision of his life. "This isn't over, Harper," he said, backing toward the door. "Not by a long shot." "Oh, but it is," Harper replied, his confidence absolute. "It ended the day you chose whiskey over your family. Get out of my town drunk, and don't come back unless you want to watch your boy suffer even more." As Ethan stepped back into the punishing sunlight, he could hear Harper's mocking laughter following him like a curse. But louder than that was the sound of chains rattling in the workhouse yard and the broken voice of a child calling out for a father who had failed him once, but would not fail him again. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Ethan recognized many of the faces, people he'd once protected, merchants he'd helped, families he'd kept safe during his years as sheriff. But now, they looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear, as if his very presence might bring Harper's wrath down upon them like a plague. "Ethan, A tentative voice called out from the crowd. He turned to see Murphy O'Brien, the old Irish bartender who had once been his closest friend. The man's face was etched with lines of worry and premature aging, but his eyes still held a spark of the warmth Ethan remembered from better times. "Murphy?" Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see a friendly face. Wish I could say the same about the circumstances." Murphy replied, glancing nervously at the workhouse like a man expecting an attack. "We heard you were back in town. Didn't expect this. How long has it been like this?" Ethan asked, gesturing toward the forbidding structure that housed his son. Murphy looked around carefully, then leaned closer. "Started about 3 years ago, right after you left. The town council brought in Harper to replace you. Said he came highly recommended from back east, had experience with urban pacification and such fancy talk. And the workhouse." Murphy's weathered face grew dark as a thundercloud. "Harper's pet project. Said every growing town needed a place to deal with vagrants, orphans, and petty criminals. Made it sound like progress, like we were becoming civilized." His voice turned bitter as alkali water. Of course, once it was built, Harper found all sorts of reasons to fill it up. Vagrancy theft disturbing the peace hell I've seen kids thrown in there for talking back to their elders or looking at his men sideways. The picture Murphy painted was one of systematic oppression and abuse. Harper hadn't just taken over law enforcement, he'd effectively seized control of the entire town through fear and intimidation. It was a cancer that had spread through every level of society, turning neighbor against neighbor and destroying the sense of community that had once defined Copper Gulch. "There's got to be someone willing to stand up to him," Ethan said, desperation creeping into his voice like poison ivy. "Someone with enough influence or courage to—" "You think you're the first person to have that bright idea?" Murphy interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tom Bradley tried to organize the merchants against Harper. Found him beaten half to death in an alley 2 days later. Doc Patterson wanted to report it to the territorial authorities, but Harper convinced him it was just a robbery gone wrong." The conversation was cut short by the arrival of 3 men who swaggered into the square, with the arrogance of those who knew they were untouchable. Ethan recognized them as Harper's deputies men, who had been hired not for their dedication to justice, but for their willingness to enforce the sheriff's will through violence and intimidation. "Well, well," said the lead deputy, a scarred man named Briggs, whose face looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull knife. "Look what the cat dragged in from the desert. Heard you were back in town cross, thought you'd be long gone by now." "Just catching up with old friends," Ethan replied, not turning around. "No law against that, is there? Depends on what you're catching up about," Briggs said, moving closer with the predatory grace of a mountain lion. "Sheriff Harper's got a keen interest in your activities. Might be best if you finished your business and moved along." Murphy had gone pale, as Milk clearly terrified of what might happen if a confrontation broke out in the town square. The other townspeople were already edging away like water from oil, unwilling to risk being caught in the crossfire of Harper's justice. "I said I'd leave town," Ethan said carefully, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest like a furnace. "I didn't say when. You're saying it now." Briggs replied, his hand moving to his gun with practiced ease. "Right now, before we have ourselves a problem." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap. Ethan could feel the weight of every eye in the square, could sense the fear radiating from the townspeople like heat from a forge. This was exactly what Harper wanted, a public confrontation that would demonstrate his power and crush any lingering hope of resistance. But Ethan had learned patience during his years of wandering. He'd developed the hunter's instinct for waiting for the right moment to strike, and he knew this wasn't it. Getting himself shot in the town square wouldn't help Jamie, it would only leave the boy more alone and hopeless than ever. "Tell Harper I'll be seeing him soon." Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. He was speaking to Briggs, but his words were meant for everyone who could hear. "Tell him Ethan Cross keeps his promises." As he walked back to his horse with measured steps, Ethan caught one last glimpse of the workhouse through the fence. Jamie was still chained to the post, his small body slumped with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert and watching. Their gazes met across the dusty yard, and Ethan saw something that gave him hope. His son's expression wasn't one of defeat, but of quiet determination. The boy was waiting for him. After 4 years of abandonment and 2 years of hell, Jamie still believed his father would find a way to save him. That faith was both a blessing and a burden. But it was also the fuel that would drive Ethan to do whatever was necessary to make things right. The sun was setting like a ball of fire as Ethan made his way to the abandoned silver mine on the outskirts of town. The old workings had been played out for years, leaving behind a maze of tunnels and shafts that provided perfect hiding places for a man who needed to stay out of sight. It wasn't comfortable, but it was secure, and it gave him a base of operations where he could plan his next move without Harper's men breathing down his neck. As he unsaddled his horse and prepared to make camp, Ethan pulled out the faded photograph he'd carried with him for 4 years, a picture of himself, Sarah, and 8-year-old Jamie taken on the boy's birthday. The image was creased and worn from handling, but it still captured the happiness they'd shared before fever and grief had torn their family apart like a tornado. "I'm going to bring him home, Sarah," he whispered to the desert wind. "I swear on your grave, I'm going to make this right." The night air carried the sound of children's voices from the workhouse, not the laughter of youngsters at play, but the exhausted murmur of those too tired to sleep. Somewhere in that forbidding structure, Jamie was probably lying on a thin mattress in some overcrowded dormitory, wondering if his father would keep his word or abandon him again. Ethan listened to those sounds and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest like a stone. Harper thought he'd broken the spirit of Copper Gulch so completely that no one would dare challenge him. But the sheriff had made one crucial mistake. He'd hurt the one person in the world that Ethan Cross would die to protect. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. The next morning found Ethan crouched in the shadows behind the general store, watching the workhouse through a pair of field glasses he'd retrieved from his saddlebags. The routine was grimly efficient. Children roused from their beds before dawn marched to the well for washing like prisoners, given a meager breakfast of thin gruel and stale bread, then assigned to their various work details. Jamie was among the group hauling water from the well, his movements slow and painful, but his back straight with the kind of dignity that couldn't be broken by chains or whips. Ethan watched his son struggle with buckets that were too heavy for his thin arms, watched him stumble and nearly fall, watched him get back up and continue working despite the obvious pain. "He's tougher than he looks," a voice said beside him. Ethan spun around to find Doc Patterson standing in the alley, his medical bag in hand, and worry etched deep in his weathered face. "Doc," Ethan said, lowering the field glasses. "Didn't hear you coming." "Old habits from the war," Patterson replied with a grim smile. "Had to learn to move quiet when Harper's men are always watching. Can't have the town doctor being seen conspiring with troublemakers." "Is that what I am now, a troublemaker?" Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan's face with the careful attention of a man who had seen too much suffering. "You're a father trying to save his son. That makes you dangerous to men like Harper." "Then help me," Ethan said, desperation creeping into his voice. "You've got influence in this town. People trust you. If you spoke out against what's happening, I'd end up in that workhouse myself," Patterson interrupted. "Or worse. Harper doesn't tolerate dissent, Ethan. He's got informants everywhere, and he's not afraid to use violence when intimidation fails. So you're just going to stand by and watch children suffer? The accusation hit its mark like an arrow finding its target. Patterson's face flushed with anger and shame. "You think I haven't tried? I've written letters to the territorial authorities, sent reports to the federal marshals. They either get lost in the bureaucracy or disappear entirely. Harper's got connections, Ethan. People in high places who make sure his crimes stay buried." "What about the town council, the mayor?" Patterson's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "Mayor Hutchins tried to investigate the workhouse conditions last year. Next thing anyone knew, he was arrested for embezzlement and sent to the territorial prison. The new mayor is Harper's puppet, and so is half the town council. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Harper hadn't just seized control of law enforcement, he'd systematically eliminated or compromised every source of legitimate authority in Copper Gulch. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation carried out with the kind of ruthless efficiency that spoke of long experience. There's got to be something. Ethan said, his frustration boiling over like a pot left too long on the stove. "Some weakness, some way to—" "There is," Patterson said quietly. "But it's not what you think." The doctor reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've been keeping records," he said. "Every child who's been brought to me from the workhouse, every suspicious death, every accident that Harper's men have claimed. It's all here." Ethan took the journal and flipped through the pages, his heart growing heavier with each entry. Children with broken bones, malnutrition, signs of systematic abuse. Deaths that had been ruled natural causes, but showed clear evidence of violence. A pattern of cruelty that painted a picture of institutionalized murder. "Why haven't you shown this to anyone?" Patterson's voice was heavy with self-loathing. "Because I'm a coward. Because I'm afraid of what Harper would do to me if he found out. Because I'd rather live with the guilt than die for the truth. But you're showing it to me." Patterson nodded. "Because you're the only one who might be able to do something about it. You were a good sheriff, Ethan. A fair man who understood that justice isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about protecting the innocent." The weight of the journal in Ethan's hands felt like a sacred trust. These weren't just medical records, they were testimony from the voiceless evidence of crimes that demanded justice. But evidence was useless without someone in authority who was willing to act on it. "The federal marshals," Ethan began, "are 3 days' ride away." Patterson interrupted. "And by the time they get here, Harper will have destroyed any evidence and silenced any witnesses. You want to save your son, Ethan. You're going to have to do it yourself." The implication was clear. If Ethan wanted to rescue Jamie, he would have to become something more than a father seeking justice. He would have to become a weapon of righteous vengeance, striking at the heart of Harper's operation with the kind of precision that could only come from desperate love. "I'll need help," Ethan said, closing the journal. "I can't do this alone." "You won't be alone," Patterson replied. "There are others who are tired of living in fear. Murphy at the saloon, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, even some of the younger men who remember what this town used to be like. They're scared, but they're also angry. They just need someone to show them that Harper can be beaten. And if I fail," Patterson's smile was sad but determined, "then at least we'll have tried. Sometimes that's all a man can do, try to leave the world a little better than he found it." As the doctor walked away, Ethan turned his attention back to the workhouse. The children were being marched back inside for their midday meal, but Jamie lingered in the yard, his eyes scanning the fence as if searching for something. Or someone. Their gazes met across the dusty expanse, and Ethan saw his son's lips move in a single silent word, "Papa." The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened, despite 4 years of abandonment and 2 years of hell, Jamie still believed in him, still trusted that his father would find a way to make things right. That faith was both a blessing and a burden. but it was also the fuel that would drive Ethan to do whatever was necessary to keep his promise. Harper might have the advantage now, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd hurt the one person in the world that Ethan Cross would die to protect. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. The Silver Dollar Saloon had once been the beating heart of Copper Gulch's social life. A place where cowboys and merchants, farmers and miners could gather to share news, settle disputes, and forget their troubles for a few precious hours. But as Ethan pushed through the batwing doors that evening, he found the atmosphere transformed into something darker and more oppressive. The once cheerful establishment had become a den of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Men hunched over their drinks like conspirators, speaking in low tones about missing livestock, arbitrary fines, and the ever-present threat of Harper's justice. The laughter was forced, the camaraderie strained, and the sense of community that had once defined the place was nowhere to be found. Murphy O'Brien stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with the mechanical precision of a man going through the motions of normal life. But his eyes were alert, constantly scanning the room for signs of trouble or Harper's informants. When he saw Ethan, his face broke into a careful smile. "Ethan," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to seem casual. "What can I get you?" "Information," Ethan replied, sliding onto a bar stool. "And maybe a cup of coffee if you've got it." Murphy nodded and poured a cup of thick, bitter coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the stove too long. "Information about what, though? I think I can guess. My son. This town. What happened to turn Copper Gulch into a place where children get chained up like animals?" The bartender glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Not here," he said quietly. "Too many ears if you catch my meaning. Meet me at the old church after closing time. We'll talk then." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Ethan nursed his coffee and listened to the conversations around him, picking up fragments of information about Harper's regime. The picture that emerged was one of systematic oppression, arbitrary arrests, confiscated property, children taken from their families on trumped-up charges. But it was the fear that struck him most forcefully. These weren't just people living under an authoritarian system. They were a community that had been broken by terror, turned into isolated individuals who were afraid to trust their neighbors or speak their minds. Harper had done more than seize power. He destroyed the very social fabric that held the town together. As the evening wore on, Ethan noticed a thin man with nervous eyes and nicotine-stained fingers who kept glancing in his direction. When their eyes met, the man quickly looked away, but not before Ethan saw the recognition there. Word of his return had spread through Harper's network like wildfire, and the web was already tightening around him. "Time to go," Murphy said quietly, collecting Ethan's empty cup. "Back door, 5 minutes." Ethan nodded and made his way casually to the rear of the saloon, slipping out through the kitchen into the alley behind the building. The night air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of sage and creosote from the surrounding desert. In the distance, he could see the lights of the workhouse burning like malevolent eyes in the darkness. 5 minutes later, Murphy emerged from the saloon, his face grim with worry. "We need to move fast," he said. "Harper's men are already asking questions about your visit. Won't be long before they start making connections." They made their way through the dark streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares and sticking to the shadows. The old church stood on a hill overlooking the town, its whitewashed walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. The building had been abandoned for years, its congregation scattered by economic hardship and Harper's policies. But it still retained an air of sanctity that made it feel like neutral ground. Inside, the pews were covered with dust and the altar was bare, but the fundamental architecture of faith remained intact. Murphy lit a single candle and set it on the communion table, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. "How bad is it?" Ethan asked without preamble. "Worse than you can imagine." Murphy replied, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. Harper didn't just take over law enforcement, he systematically eliminated every source of legitimate authority in this town. The mayor, the town council, the territorial representatives, they're all either dead in prison or in his pocket. Murphy pulled out a flask and took a long swallow, his hands trembling slightly. You want to know the worst part? Most of us knew what was happening. We could see the signs, the arbitrary arrests, the children disappearing, the way people started avoiding eye contact and speaking in whispers. But we were too scared to do anything about it. Fear's a powerful thing, Ethan said. Harper knows how to use it. He's got a genius for it. Murphy agreed. He doesn't just threaten violence, he demonstrates it. Public beatings, mysterious disappearances, accidents that happen to people who ask too many questions. Pretty soon, everyone's too terrified to speak up. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside. Both men froze their hands, moving instinctively to their weapons. The footsteps paused at the church door, and for a moment, the only sound was the flickering of the candle flame. Then a voice called out softly, "Murphy, it's me." The door opened to reveal Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner, her face pale but determined. Behind her came Doc Patterson, and behind him 3 other men that Ethan recognized as longtime residents of Copper Gulch, including Jenkins, a farmer whose teenage son had been arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to the workhouse. "We heard you were meeting," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "We want to help." "It's too dangerous," Ethan protested. "Harper's already suspicious. If he finds out about this, he'll kill us all." Patterson interrupted. "Just like he killed Mayor Hutchins, just like he killed Tom Bradley, just like he's killing those children in the workhouse. The only difference is whether we die fighting or die cowering." The others nodded in agreement, and Ethan felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. These weren't warriors or gunfighters. They were ordinary people who had found the courage to stand up to evil. It was exactly the kind of grassroots resistance that could topple a tyrant if it was properly organized and led. "What do you need us to do?" Jenkins asked, his voice thick with emotion at the thought of his imprisoned son. "I need information," Ethan said. "Guard schedules, building layouts, anything that might help me get to Jamie. And I need you to be ready to act when the time comes." "Act how?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Harper's power comes from fear and isolation. If we can break both of those at the same time, show people that he can be beaten, and give them something to rally around, we might be able to turn the tide." Murphy leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been hope. "You're talking about a revolution." "I'm talking about justice," Ethan replied. "Sometimes they're the same thing." But as they planned their resistance, Jenkins seemed nervous, constantly glancing at the door and shifting uncomfortably in his seat. When pressed for details about the workhouse layout, he provided vague answers and claimed he didn't remember specifics from his brief visit to see his son. The meeting broke up an hour later, with each person taking on specific responsibilities. Murphy would gather intelligence from his customers, Patterson would document any new evidence of Harper's crimes, and the others would quietly sound out trusted friends and neighbors about their willingness to resist. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson approached Ethan with something clutched in her hands. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing a small object into his palm. "It belonged to my son Thomas before Harper took him away." Ethan looked down to see a wooden whistle, intricately carved with simple but elegant designs. "Your son died in the workhouse 3 months ago," she said, her voice thick with grief. "Harper said it was pneumonia, but I know better. The boy was healthy as a horse when they took him. It was the work that killed him, the work and the cruelty and the slow starvation. I'm sorry." Ethan said the words, feeling inadequate in the face of such loss. "Don't be sorry," Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. "Be angry. Be angry enough to make Harper pay for what he's done to our children. As the group dispersed into the night, Ethan noticed that Jenkins lingered behind, claiming he needed to check on something. But instead of heading home, the farmer slipped away into the darkness, moving with the furtive haste of a man with a secret mission. The next morning, Ethan began his surveillance in earnest. Using the skills he'd learned as a sheriff and refined during his years as a drifter, he studied the workhouse's routines, mapped its defenses, and identified its weak points. The building was formidable, but it wasn't impregnable. Every fortress had vulnerabilities, and Harper's arrogance had made him careless about some of the most basic security measures. But it was the discovery of the mine entrance that changed everything. The old silver workings extended far beneath the town, and one of the abandoned shafts emerged right next to the workhouse compound. It would require careful navigation and a strong stomach for enclosed spaces, but it offered a way to approach the building without being seen by the guards. As Ethan explored the tunnels by lantern light, he found something that made his blood run cold as Winter Creek water. The shaft was littered with small bones, the remains of children who had died in the workhouse and been disposed of in the most callous manner possible. Harper wasn't just running a prison, he was operating a death camp. And the evidence was literally buried beneath the feet of the townspeople. Among the bones, Ethan found a small metal object that made his heart stop. It was a locket tarnished with age, but still recognizable, the same locket he'd given Sarah on their wedding day, the one she'd passed down to Jamie before her death. The boy must have hidden it, somehow kept it as a reminder of better times, only to have it taken from him in death. But as he examined the locket more closely, Ethan realized something that changed everything. The metal was old and tarnished, but it showed signs of recent handling. The chain was broken, but the break was fresh. This wasn't from a child who had died months ago. This was from someone who had been here recently. The implication hit him like a physical blow. Jamie wasn't just alive. He had been down here in these tunnels, perhaps trying to escape. The locket was a message, a breadcrumb left behind to guide his father to the truth. That evening, as Ethan prepared for what he knew would be the most dangerous mission of his life, he took out the photograph of his family and studied it one last time. Sarah's face smiled back at him, full of love and hope, and the kind of faith that could move mountains. In her eyes, he saw the woman who had believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. "I won't let you down," he whispered to the image. "Either of you." The moon was dark as Ethan made his way through the mine tunnels, guided by a small lantern and the rough map he'd drawn during his earlier explorations. The air was stale and oppressive, thick with the smell of decay and old earth. Several times he had to crawl on his hands and knees through passages that had partially collapsed, feeling the weight of tons of rock above his head. But finally, after what felt like hours of claustrophobic navigation, he reached the shaft that emerged near the workhouse. The opening was concealed by a screen of mesquite bushes, providing perfect cover for his approach. Through the vegetation, he could see the guard tower where Harper's man dozed at his post, a bottle of whiskey visible on the table beside him. The office building was dark, except for a single light burning in what Ethan assumed was Harper's private office. As he watched, he saw a figure move past the window, tall, lean, unmistakably the sheriff himself. Harper was working late, which meant he would be alone and vulnerable. But as Ethan prepared to make his move, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Someone was coming through the tunnels behind him, moving with the careful stealth of a man who knew his way around underground passages. Ethan extinguished his lantern and pressed himself against the tunnel wall, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the faint glow of another lantern. Whoever was coming, they were almost upon him. "Cross," a voice whispered in the darkness. "Cross, are you down here?" It was Jenkins the farmer, whose son was imprisoned in the workhouse. But what was he doing here? How did he know about the tunnels? Jenkins," Ethan called out softly. "What are you doing here?" The farmer emerged from the shadows, his face pale and drawn with fear. "I had to warn you," he said, his voice shaking. "Harper knows about the meeting. He knows about the plan. How does he know? Ethan asked, but even as he spoke the words, he realized the answer. The nervous glances, the vague answers, the way Jenkins had lingered behind after the meeting, it all made sense now. You told him? Ethan said, his voice flat with the weight of betrayal. Jenkins nodded miserably. He's got my boy Cross, my only son. He said if I didn't tell him what you were planning, he'd make sure Tommy never saw another sunrise. So you sold us all out to save your own son. Wouldn't you? Jenkins shot back, his voice cracking with desperation. Wouldn't you do anything to protect your child? The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut because he knew the answer. Yes, he would do anything to protect Jamie. But that didn't make Jenkins's betrayal any less devastating. They're coming, Jenkins whispered. Harper's men, they know about the tunnels. They'll be here any minute. As if summoned by his words, the sound of voices echoed through the underground passages. Harper's men were indeed coming, and they were coming fast. Ethan had walked into a trap, and now he was caught like a rat in a maze. There's still time, Jenkins said desperately. If you go back now, if you leave town, I'm not leaving without my son. Ethan replied, his voice hard as granite. The voices were getting closer now, accompanied by the bouncing light of multiple lanterns. Ethan estimated at least 4 men, maybe more. They were armed, and they knew these tunnels, which gave them a significant advantage. Then you're going to die down here. Jenkins said, his voice heavy with guilt and sorrow. Maybe, Ethan replied, checking his weapons. But I'm not going down without a fight. The next few minutes were a blur of violence and chaos. Harper's men came around the bend, with guns drawn ready to capture or kill the man who had threatened their boss's empire. But Ethan had the advantage of desperation and the narrow confines of the tunnel, which made it difficult for multiple attackers to engage him simultaneously. The first man went down with Ethan's knife in his throat, his scream echoing through the underground passages. The second took a bullet from Ethan's pistol, his lantern shattering and plunging part of the tunnel into darkness. But there were more coming, and Ethan's ammunition was limited. That's when he remembered the cache of mining explosives he'd discovered during his earlier explorations. The old miners had left behind several sticks of dynamite, along with blasting caps and fuses. It was dangerous. The explosives were old and unstable, but it might be his only chance. Working with desperate efficiency, Ethan rigged a crude bomb using 2 sticks of dynamite and a short fuse. He lit the fuse and threw the device down the tunnel toward Harper's approaching men, and then pressed himself against the wall and waited for the explosion. The blast was deafening in the confined space, bringing down part of the tunnel ceiling and trapping Harper's men on the other side. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, Ethan couldn't see or breathe. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was free. Jenkins hadn't been so lucky. The farmer had been caught in the blast and lay motionless beneath a pile of rubble, his betrayal punished by the very forces he'd tried to appease. Ethan felt a moment of pity for the man, but there was no time for mourning. Harper would know by now that his trap had failed, and he would be preparing for a direct assault. Using the chaos as cover, Ethan made his way through the remaining tunnel sections to the workhouse compound. The explosion had awakened the guards, and he could hear shouting and running footsteps as they tried to determine what had happened. But the confusion also provided him with an opportunity. The guard dog that patrolled the perimeter was barking frantically, but it was chained to a post and could only cover a limited area. Ethan waited until the animal was distracted by the commotion, then slipped from the tunnel and made his way across the compound toward the main building. The workhouse was in chaos. Children were crying and calling out in fear, guards were running back and forth trying to restore order, and somewhere in the distance, Harper's voice could be heard shouting orders. It was the perfect cover for a rescue operation. Ethan found the door to the main dormitory and kicked it open, revealing a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dozens of children were crowded into a space designed for half their number, sleeping on thin straw mattresses and covered with blankets that were little more than rags. They were all painfully thin, their faces marked by the kind of suffering that no child should ever have to endure. But it was the sight of Jamie that nearly brought him to his knees. His son was huddled in a corner, his wrists still bearing the marks of the chains that had bound him. The boy's face was gaunt and hollow-aged, beyond his years by the horrors he had witnessed and endured. "Papa." Jamie's voice was barely a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "I'm here, son," Ethan said, kneeling beside the boy and gathering him into his arms. "I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again." The reunion was everything Ethan had dreamed of and more. Jamie clung to him with desperate intensity, 4 years of separation and 2 years of hell pouring out in a flood of tears and broken words. Other children gathered around them, their faces showing a mixture of wonder and hope. As they witnessed something they had almost forgotten, existed the love between a father and son. But their moment of joy was short-lived. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Harper and his men, and Ethan realized they were trapped. The sheriff appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with rage and his gun drawn. Touching reunion. Harper said, his voice dripping with malice. "But it's about to be cut short." "Let the children go," Ethan said, standing slowly with Jamie still clinging to him. "This is between you and me." Harper's laugh was cold and bitter. "Oh, but it's not just between us, is it? This is about so much more than your pathetic attempt to rescue your son. This is about Justice Cross. Justice for all the years you had everything I wanted while I had nothing. I don't understand." Ethan said, though, even as he spoke, fragments of memory were beginning to surface. "Don't you remember me?" Harper asked, his voice rising with hysteria. "Don't you remember your old cavalry partner, the man who saved your life during the Apache raid? The man who was court-martialed for cowardice while you got all the medals and glory?" The truth hit Ethan like a physical blow. Jed Harper, private. Jed Harper, the young soldier who had served under him during the Indian Wars. The man who had indeed saved his life during a desperate battle, only to be blamed when other soldiers died. The man who had been drummed out of the service in disgrace, while Ethan went on to become a respected sheriff. "Jed," Ethan said softly. "I remember now. But that was 20 years ago. You can't still be, can't I?" Harper interrupted, his eyes blazing with decades of accumulated hatred. "Can't I still be angry about the injustice, about the way you moved on to have everything I wanted while I was left with nothing? The respect, the position, the family, all of it should have been mine." The depth of Harper's obsession was staggering. For 20 years he had nursed his grudge, plotting his revenge, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when Ethan had fallen from grace, Harper had seized the opportunity to take everything from him, his town, his reputation, and finally, his son. "So you came here to destroy what I built," Ethan said, understanding at last. "I came here to show you how easily everything you valued could be taken away." Harper replied, "But you weren't here to see it. You ran away like a coward, so I made your son pay for your sins." The revelation that Jamie's suffering had been motivated by a personal vendetta made Ethan's blood boil with rage. Every moment of pain, every day of fear, every night of hopelessness, all of it had been designed to hurt a man who wasn't even there to witness it. "You're insane," Ethan said, his voice thick with disgust. "I'm justice," Harper shot back. "I'm the reckoning you've been avoiding for 20 years. But even as they spoke, Ethan could hear sounds from outside, the voices of townspeople, the clatter of wagons, the neighing of horses. Murphy and the others had kept their word. Despite the danger, despite the fear, they had come to fight for their children and their town. Harper heard it too, and his face went pale. "No," he whispered. "They wouldn't dare. They're too frightened, too broken." "They're not broken," Ethan said, moving slowly toward the door with Jamie in his arms. "They're just waiting for someone to show them that you can be beaten." The sound of gunfire erupted outside as the townspeople clashed with Harper's remaining men. It was a desperate battle fought by ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage in the face of tyranny. They might not be professional soldiers, but they were fighting for their children, their homes, and their freedom. Harper raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "If I can't have my revenge, then I'll settle for killing you both." But before he could fire, a small figure darted from the shadows behind him. It was Billy Morrison, the sick boy Jamie had tried to help with the stolen bread. The child had been hiding in the workhouse, too weak to work, but too afraid to reveal himself. Now, with the courage born of desperation, he struck Harper across the back of the head with a piece of broken wood. The blow wasn't strong enough to seriously injure the sheriff, but it was enough to spoil his aim. Harper's shot went wide, embedding itself in the wall behind Ethan's head. The sheriff spun around, raising his gun to shoot the boy, but Ethan was already moving. The two men collided in a tangle of limbs and violence, crashing through the dormitory and scattering the frightened children. Harper was younger and uninjured, but Ethan fought with the fury of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. They rolled across the floor, each trying to gain control of Harper's weapon. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Harper snarled as they struggled. "A fair fight between soldiers. Let's see if you're still the hero you used to be." "I was never a hero," Ethan replied, landing a solid punch to Harper's jaw. "I was just a man doing his job." The fight was brutal and desperate. Harper managed to drive a knee into Ethan's ribs, sending him sprawling across the floor. But as the sheriff raised his gun for the killing shot, Jamie appeared beside him, holding the wooden whistle Mrs. Henderson had given to his father. "This is for Billy," the boy said, and drove the sharp end of the whistle into Harper's eye. Harper screamed and staggered backward, blood streaming down his face. Ethan seized the opportunity to tackle him again, this time managing to wrestle the gun away. The two men rolled toward the open door, their struggle taking them out into the yard, where the battle between townspeople and guards continued to rage. In the confusion and darkness, it was hard to tell friend from foe. Gunfire flashed like lightning, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. Harper, half blinded but still dangerous, pulled a knife from his boot and lunged at Ethan with desperate fury. The blade caught Ethan across the ribs, sending fire through his side. But the wound wasn't deep, and his years of hard living had given him a tolerance for pain that Harper couldn't match. He grabbed the sheriff's wrist and twisted, hearing the satisfying crack of breaking bone. Harper's scream was cut short as Ethan's fist connected with his throat. The sheriff dropped to the ground, gasping for air, his face turning purple. For a moment, Ethan considered finishing him, putting an end to the man who had caused so much suffering. But then he heard Jamie's voice calling his name, and he remembered what this fight was really about. It wasn't about revenge or justice or settling old scores. It was about love, the love between a father and son, and the love of a community. For its children, the love of freedom over tyranny. "It's over, Harper," Ethan said, standing over the fallen sheriff. "Your reign of terror is finished." Harper tried to speak, but only a croak emerged from his damaged throat. Blood frothed on his lips, and his eyes were glazing over with the approach of death. Whatever last words he might have wanted to say were lost forever. As the sun rose over Copper Gulch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the townspeople worked to secure the compound and tend to the wounded. The battle was over, and they had won. Harper was dead, his men were captured or fled, and the children were free. But it was the sight of Jamie playing the wooden whistle for the other children that truly moved Ethan. The boy had found the instrument among the debris of the fight, and now he played a simple melody that seemed to carry all the hope and promise of a new beginning. "That's beautiful, son," Ethan said, kneeling beside his boy. "Mrs. Henderson taught me how to play it," Jamie replied. "She said music can heal even the deepest wounds." As father and son sat together in the yard, where so much suffering had taken place, Ethan felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The road ahead would be difficult, marked by the need to rebuild and heal. But they would face it together, strengthened by their love for each other and their commitment to ensuring that such horrors could never happen again. The whistle's clear notes echoed across the desert, carrying with them the voices of all those who had been silenced and the hopes of all those who had been oppressed, and the promise that justice would prevail wherever good people found the courage to fight for what was right. 3 months later, Ethan stood in the doorway of their new home, watching Jamie help the other children tend to a small garden they had planted where the workhouse had once stood. The boy had grown stronger and healthier, his laughter returning like spring after a long winter. But more importantly, he had found his purpose helping other children heal from their trauma and teaching them that they were not alone. A letter had arrived that morning from the territorial governor, officially commending Ethan for his role in exposing the corruption and offering him a position as a federal investigator. The job would take him to other towns, other situations, where children might be suffering as Jamie had suffered. "Will you take it?" Jamie asked, having read the letter over his father's shoulder. "What do you think I should do?" Ethan replied. Jamie was quiet for a moment, thinking with the seriousness of someone who had lived through experiences that most adults could never imagine. "I think you should take it," he said finally. "There are other children out there who need someone like you to save them." "But that would mean leaving you again," Ethan said. "You wouldn't be leaving me." Jamie replied, his voice strong and sure. "You'd be carrying me with you. Every time you save a child, you'd be saving me all over again." The wisdom in his son's words took Ethan's breath away. Here was a child who had survived unimaginable cruelty, yet he had emerged with his capacity for compassion intact. Sarah would have been proud of the man their son was becoming. As the sun set over the desert painting, the sky in brilliant colors, Ethan felt the weight of the past finally lift from his shoulders. The chains of guilt and regret that had bound him for so long were broken at last, replaced by the golden bonds of love and purpose that would guide him for the rest of his days. The wooden whistle rested on the mantel of their home, a reminder of the journey they had taken and the music that could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, Ethan could almost hear Sarah's voice whispering her approval. The fight was over, but the healing had just begun. And in a small house on the outskirts of Copper Gulch, a father and son prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by love, strengthened by trial, and committed to ensuring that justice would prevail wherever they went. The whistle's song continued, a melody of hope that would never be silenced again.